Robbie Lawler was out of control.
This is Double Cross, the murder of Robbie Lawler.
It was going to be an all-out war with him in the middle of it.
A Crime World special investigation podcast based on my new book, Web of Betrayal, wherever you get your podcasts.
Many people always think of Irish illegals going into the US as kind of an 80s pastime, maybe, but it continues up until this day, obviously. And we've had a series of really busts, I suppose, of Irish people sneaking into the US in recent times. And this week we have had a guy who's come to court, and we've had sort of details of the operation of how it works.
Yeah, it was an interesting one. There was a full criminal complaint that was lodged in upstate New York. And it centres around a guy based in this town called Messina, which is right on the border with Canada on the southern bank of the St. Lawrence River. And this guy, anyway, AJ O'Shea is his name. So he's facing indictment, or facing possible court case over that. It centred on a couple of different attempts where there was people caught in a boat. They'd managed to run themselves aground. They had no illegal immigrants. And then, a day later, some people in the same boat were stuck again. Yet this time there was two individuals who had no documentation that allowed them to be in the US and described themselves as citizens of the United Kingdom. And a couple of days later, then they had information that O'Shea was going to try and bring in 15 people. So they kept surveillance on the house. But before that happened, they have obviously a system of cameras on the border, and some of these were activated. And there's a group of 5 individuals spotted walking across the open ground. They were seen then. I think there was a black SUV that was spotted in the area, so they assumed that picked them up. And when they stopped that, they found 2 guys in it, 2 American citizens, and they found an adult couple and 3 children. So the male adult described himself as an Irish citizen, as did she, and he was identified in the court documents as a man called Andrew Cash. Now, there was no other details about him or who he was, and I know it's a common name. There's
many Andrew Cashes that have hit the papers for one reason or another in Ireland, so we don't know exact details. I mean, there was an interesting bit of it as well. Somebody was getting paid in crack cocaine as well as cash, so it's not...
Yeah, I mean, all these people were once they were caught by Border Patrol agents, they were brought back to the station. They were talking about 4 or 5 different incidents, not just the one with Andrew Cash. But even in his case, the 2 Americans that were caught, immediately kind of fessed up and blamed this guy AJ as the coordinator, which Cash had on his phone. What he said he did, but he deleted out of fear of retribution, is what he told officers at the time. But one of the guys said he got something like $250 for his role to go and pick up these guys, and another guy was to get $100 and was going to get directly 1,000 Canadian dollars directly from Cash to bring him on to New Jersey. They also said that this guy O'Shea had also paid them in this case with crack cocaine, which they smoked before they went to pick up the Irish passenger, which might explain why the other boats again. Some of the individuals involved with that who managed to run themselves aground were getting paid in narcotics as well, including fentanyl, which I presume isn't great for your boat handling skills on the St. Lawrence River in the middle of November.
It's a unique management tool to employ, all right, it has to be said. Now, I mean, funnily enough, actually, this comes just about a week after Donald Trump made a big issue of the Canadian border. He threatened to impose tariffs, actually, on Mexico, and which you would imagine there's a lot of people coming over from Mexico, and that border has been probably the primary point of debate in the US presidential election. But he also threatened to put tariffs on Canada because people were being smuggled across the border. So it must be these sort of operations that he's talking about, I would imagine.
No, without a doubt. I mean, if you go onto the local peoples in Messina, some of the Facebook comments surrounding the story are very much on that vein. It's like, Donald Trump is right. These people are coming in. I mean, we're not saying anything about this particular Andrew Cash, although it did emerge in the court documents that he has an extraditable warrant from Boston. So presumably that was for some kind of an offence. Could be anything from traffic offence to something more serious. So we don't know what that's about. But O'Shea, then when he was arrested, he again also kind of pretty much fessed up everything without an attorney present, and talked about that, you know, it was part of a wider ring, that he was just one person, he wasn't the main organizer, and that he referred to everybody coming over as Irish. It was an Irish group.
Yeah.
So presumably, as far as he was concerned, these were all Irish people that were coming over, and that there was another person had approached him in October. But he said that as far as he knew, a lot of them were involved in criminality, which would feed into exactly the narrative that Donald Trump is trying to point out. Although if these are kind of white Europeans, it might kind of be a little one, a slight flaw in the ointment there, but he might just ignore this one and just, you know, talk about the illegals without mentioning the colour of their skin on this occasion.
No, but it has to be said that there are these groups of travelling con men, as they call, with Irish backgrounds, or some of them at least having Irish backgrounds, that do repeatedly pop up in the US media. And we have had cases that we've spoken about before of people being extradited back to here or to the UK. So it is an actual phenomenon where these con men, a lot of them involved in home improvement scams, they tend to move down, possibly mostly down through the sort of eastern part of the US.
Yeah, I think they go to areas where they can... I suppose play off the fact that they're Irish, and it gives people a sense of trust, you know, that, oh, there's some Irish builders, they must be all right, they're going to do a great job in tarmacking my driveway, or putting down concrete, or fixing the roof shingles, that kind of stuff. But I mean, but what I kind of find interesting is the amount of money. I mean, like this guy Cash, whoever he is, talked about that he was going to pay 3,500 Canadian dollars to AJ, and thought he was on as far as he was concerned, he was being driven there at the time when the Border Patrol stopped them. And then of course the other guy said then that Cash was going to give him another 1,000 to bring him on down to New Jersey. So that was costing him 4,500 to get his family as far as New Jersey. Now we know from the other cases earlier. I think was it October? No, sorry, October. There was another case of people walking over the border. But before that, during the summer, there was a couple of guys arrested in Florida where they had organised. They were trying to organise a guy on a boat, but I think to go out to Bimini Islands, which is about 80 kilometres off the coast of Florida, but it's part of the Bahamas. And there was a group of Irish there, which the authorities were describing as, you know, connected to an Irish travelling fraud group, as they call them. This is their terminology they use. And this was like $60,000 that was going to be spent on the skipper of the boat. And the guy, one of them who was organising this, had travelled from Chicago down to Florida to hand over the money, but he was actually wearing a bracelet on his leg which had been put on him when he had been stopped at the Mexican border, like, you know, as an illegal immigrant.
It's a curious thing, of course, because, you know, you can, as an Irish citizen, you can get on a flight and land in the US now. You know, you have to apply for a visa and all of that, but you can, if you wanted to, nobody's going to stop you going in as such. Obviously, you're meant to leave when you say you're going to leave, and then at that point you become illegal, and maybe the authorities, you know, will pick you up if you do something. But simply getting into the country is not necessarily difficult for Irish citizens.
I think it's difficult if you already have an outstanding arrest warrant, which in this case one of them did. And sometimes it's not as straightforward as that. I mean, the three children that were with this couple, two of them actually had American passports and one had a Canadian passport. So you're talking about people who, to some extent, have been there for a while, and probably have already possibly been deported once or left once, possibly to escape, you know, some kind of trouble, that whatever they were in. But if you remember, we spoke about the Boswell couple, Oliver Boswell and his wife, who were deported back from the US by ICE. And they were wanted on fraud charges in the UK. But if you're like at some of the extradition hearing here in Ireland, then, because they were deported to Ireland, then they were being extradited back to the UK where they were wanted for the fraud offences, and it was quite a large. It was a fairly,
couple of million.
It wasn't a small thing. It was pretty much an organised crime gang defrauding vulnerable people. But during that extradition hearing, we were hearing about the fact that their children were left behind in the US and that they didn't have any documents. One of them had apparently lost their passport, and as a result, then they couldn't leave the country. And so it's a kind of a complicated thing. in that sense. Like, we had one of the professional burglary gangs that was a target a cab, and they were using two sets of names because they had changed their names by deed poll, and basically it was said in the Criminal Access Bureau affidavits put forward as evidence that they did this so that they could re-enter the United States, having previously overstayed their 90-day limit.
Yes, because that definitely does happen. If you don't leave when you say you were going to leave, your chances of getting in are zilch again. Obviously, to the US, you can do that once and never again.
Yeah, I think there's an immediate 10-year ban or something, for even for a small breach of that. And we saw it as well in another case with the members of the O'Brien family that were targeted by the Criminal Access Bureau, who were able to get in and out of Australia. Yeah. And again, and it was all listed about, the use of the Irish version of the names, changing the names by deed poll, using legitimately acquired or legitimate passports, using fraudulent documents and using the identity of other people, with similar names or who look similar. And then sometimes even just traveling on a relative's passport, and that relative then, if they're also traveling, if they're trying to get out, and which we saw in one case, they claimed their passport had been lost and were given emergency documents to get out of, to leave Australia. So, I mean, where there's a will, there's a way. And I mean, and there is, at the same time, there's people getting deported from the airport in Sydney, not having managed to get in with these techniques. I mean, it's a crude way of doing it. And similarly, we've had a string of people. We've had a string, I'd say, of Irish people connected to what the Americans call this travelling fraud group, and who have been deported back to Ireland over the last couple of years. And it sounds like, from what we know, that there's going to be more. I think a lot of these families, to some extent, have put down roots there. And of course, there is. It's interesting because there's a separate,
historical context, isn't there?
As well. There is other, ethnic Irish travellers who have been in the United States probably for 100 years or more. I remember speaking to a guy, Richard Daly, in Fort Worth in Texas, and his father had left in 1914. Now, he was 67, and this is 20 years ago. And he talked about the way of life, and traveling across the southern states, painting barns and all this kind of stuff, and that was their lifestyle. And he had a lovely kind of way of telling the story, and it was a very kind of romantic lifestyle. And he was worried then that this lifestyle was going to be affected because of bad publicity, that this particular clan, the Greenhorn Carrolls, as they were known, they had a very bad kind of would you say reputation damage it was caused by a woman called Marilyn Toogood. Now, this is going back to 2002, and she ended up being known across America as the Monster Mum because she was seen slapping and punching a toddler. Because the security cameras in the shop had turned on to watch her because they felt something suspicious was going on. She later was separately convicted of minor enough shoplifting stuff, but in the meantime, they wanted to find who this person was. So it caused a huge curiosity about the Greenhorn Carrolls and Irish travellers living in the States, which is why we went out to meet them. Yeah,
and basically these group have kind of kept together, I suppose, and maybe not integrated in the way that other Irish people who came to the US at the same time. They've kept their kind of their clan structures, I suppose. And some of those, again, sort of hit the headlines again this week in the US because there was, I don't know much about the National Hockey League, but I suppose...
We call it ice hockey here.
Ice hockey, right. But it's a guy, is it Paul Bissonnette, is it?
Paul Bissonnette, who I looked up
he might be kind of like the Pat Spillane of the hockey league, is he?
Or he'd be kind of like he'd be a second row. He'd be a Donald Lenihan. He's a big enforcer, is what he was. He was there for sorting out the rough chaps who were beating up the small, skillful guys.
But he's become kind of a kind of an outspoken pundit and a very, very well-known person in the US, maybe like a sort of Roy Keane type or something like that. And he was attacked in a sports bar, I think, and there was a load of people charged, pictured, and then kind of a day later you see all these stories about Irish con men, I suppose, and their links.
And this particular group of people, some of those people were linked in Arizona. This is where it happened, Scottsdale, Arizona. And some of the Arizona press, they had linked back to members of the Greenhorn Carrolls, the people I was talking about, which is, guess why I brought them up. Yeah. And, it was all the same surnames. And some of these guys, one of them was, Marilyn Toogood came up in the mentions as well. Yeah. But I mean, like I have to say, Bissonnette was quite entertaining in the way he spoke about it. Like that, he kind of he suggested that there was 6 or 7 of them, and they were in the face of the management, and he said this is a family restaurant, and he said if there's any trouble, you're going to have trouble with me, or words to that effect. And then, as he put it, they started chucking. So I took a few, and they took a few, and more or less ended up in a dumpster without his shirt and shoes.
Right, okay.
But he was fighting 7 of them, so
right.
I think he was a bit more experienced and probably a more sober head at this stage.
Right.
So he did quite well.
But he gave a good account of himself.
Well,
anyway.
as you do, you would give a good account of yourself.
Yeah.
Well, looking up, I was trying to look up to see, who he played for, what his position was. And as the Americans do, they always have these stats.
Yeah.
And he played 224 games, but he had 69 fights.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah,
he actually had the fights counted. So I think totally they picked on the wrong guy.
Yeah, it's a totally they actually break with play, and everybody's sets back and has a good look at the L fight. So I suppose he was well prepared. Look, it's another one that we have that we will come back to, because in a funny way, like this bust of these few Irish guys paying a few £100 to get across the border has linked in with a geopolitical scandal brought about by Donald Trump. So
somebody could find themselves being the scapegoat.
Yes,
the scapegoat
of Donald Trump.
And it isn't a couple of hundred, it's thousands. So it's big money for some people,
Yeah, exactly. So our Irish guys could cause a 10% tariff on all Canadian goods worth billions is what could happen. But let's see. Thanks, Eamon.
Always a pleasure now.
I'm Nicola Tallant, and you're watching Crime World, a podcast about criminals, drugs and the underworld in Ireland and across the globe. Make sure you subscribe to our channel and turn on notifications so you can be the first to watch all our latest episodes. You can also listen wherever you get your podcasts.